welcome you to another bumper edition of Sports Law Unscripted. Sports Law Unscripted, as you know, is the weekly sports law podcast of Petstone and Grace LP, one of the official law firms in Nigeria. So without much ado, let me introduce our team members. My name is Steve Mwabweze, first of all. So I have a couple of my colleagues here who would be unbundling some of the trending legal issues in sports. So let me quickly invite Idorenyi Umo. ID.
Good evening, Lagos. Thank you for having us once again, and I'm looking forward to a very bumper edition of Sports Law Unscripted. Thank you for having me.
All right, Ibidoyin Aino is only female team member in the cast, but a very, very important one at that. So Doyin.
Thank you very much. Good evening, listeners. I'm glad to be here on another edition of Sports Law Unscripted. Thank you.
All right, so Felix Nwosu is also an associate Petstone and Grace. Felix holds the distinctive quality of possessing an exclusive knowledge about esports. We are going to dissect esports maybe in a subsequent edition of the show. Felix, please say hi to our listeners.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here for another edition of Sports Law Unscripted.
All right, and last but definitely not the least, Ayodeji Abdul. Ayodeji.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you very much for another wonderful opportunity. Glad to be here too.
All right, so in the next 15 minutes or 60 minutes or thereabouts, we shall be dissecting quite a number of topics in sports. We'll be starting with player contracts. We'll be doing an overview of player contracts. We'll also look into, give a summary of clause-by-clause analysis of player contracts, most especially in the Nigerian Professional Premier League. And we'll be forging a path and making a case for areas of improvement, specifically with regards to some commercial expediency and technological advancements, which have more or less made it important to, or underscores the importance of including certain clauses in contracts. We shall also take the opportunity to look at the regulations on the status and the regulations on the status and transfer of players, the RSTP, which is more or less, I call it the football for leagues and for players, as well as to a reasonable extent intermediaries. The RSTP forms a very veritable tool for regulating the football industry. So that is going to form the first part of the show. And to do justice to this, I have Idorenyi, I have Felix Nwosu, and Ayodeji Abdul. Then the second leg of the show is going to encompass some, I call them evolving contract clauses in sports, most especially in football contracts. Myself and Ibidoyin Aino, doing justice to some of these interesting clauses in sports. We'll specifically be looking at clauses like garden leave clause, image rights clause, force majeure clause, and determination clause. So this, in a nutshell, is what we have in our potpourri of topics which we do this evening. So let me quickly invite Idorenyi Umo to give us an view of player contracts. What does it look like? Comparing the English Professional Premier League and the Nigerian Professional Premier League, what are the lessons for the NPFL to learn when it comes to contract drafting for players?
Okay.
ID.
Before ID takes the floor on what we can learn from the Premier League in the NPFL here, I will just do justice to the overview of a player contract, the necessary clauses or the most important clauses that should be in a player contract, and the considerations that the player and the club should have while drafting those clauses. There are several things tied to the arrangement between a player and the club beyond the financial aspect of the relationship. Without much ado, this brings me to the crux of today's discussion, which is a player's contract, and I will be doing a very brief overview. So what is a player contract? In general terms, it is a document that encapsulates the duties, obligations, and rights of both the player and the club under an employment relationship. Given the incredibly remunerative nature of football contracts, coupled with the delicate nature of the game, player contracts must be carefully drafted and meticulously scrutinized by competent lawyers advising both the club and the player. Because we've seen different situations where the lack of proper legal advice while drafting a player contract has led either the player or the club to a calamitous end. And I will give some instances. Robin Fowler was reported to have never looked at his contract. While unknown to him, there was a clause that demanded that his accommodation must be close to a fishing lake. Also, Stefan Schwarz, in his own case, signed a contract that banned him from space travel. So all these are the underpin the importance of drafting a player's contract by lawyers and the issues that must be properly analyzed and trashed out before a player signs a contract. So without wasting much of our time, I'll be taking us through certain important clauses in a player's contract. Although there are certain clauses that are boilerplate, but I'll be going into the specifics, very important clauses that must be looked at and scrutinized by both the lawyer for the club and the lawyer for the player. So first one that comes to mind is the morals clause. So apart from a player's athletic prowess on the field of play, there's also the need to ensure the moral disposition of a player conforms with that of the club. So a player's immoral conduct off the field of play is usually capable of damaging the image of the club and also the image of an endorsement company maybe. So morals clauses are very important in both player contract and endorsement agreement. Quite a number of players have suffered from reprehensible conduct which are prohibited under the morals clause. A very good example is the case of Ruben Semedo some time ago while he was at Villarreal. The player was suspended without pay when the club got wind of an allegation of manslaughter and armed robbery against the player. Also, Kobe Bryant lost several endorsements because of a sexual assault charge against him. So that underpins the very important nature of morals clause. And so what is a morals clause per se? A morals clause is a provision in a player's contract that states that certain actions or inactions of a player, even when it is in his private life, would constitute a ground for termination of the player's contract. The clause is usually used to protect the club's reputation and image, and it also enables the club to unilaterally terminate the contract of a player when the player engages in activities that can put or bring the name of the club to disrepute. So due to the delicate nature of this clause, parties must carefully draft it and ensure that certain acts that constitute that will trigger the club to terminate the contract are specifically stated. So the club should, or both parties should ensure that there are no vague words or ambiguous activities. So the specific acts should be stated. Another important clause in a player's contract is the Azados activities clause. A player's physical condition is very important to the player's performance. In fact, where if a player has a physical disability, it has the ability of bringing the team's performance below par, especially when the particular player is the star player in the team. So one of the ways the club can mitigate the chances of an out-of-field injury of a player has been to insert into the player's contract an Azados activities clause. The Azados activities clause allows the team where it deems fit to modify its financial obligations to a player under the contract if the player gets injured in any activity outside the context of his sporting activity. For instance, a footballer that engages in professional wrestling and gets injured in the process, the team or the club should not be responsible for taking care of the player's injury. So that's the importance of that clause. So there are usually issues arising from what constitutes Azados activity. For instance, if say Van Persie scores a goal and he celebrates or he jubilates and he gets injured in the process, does this clause cover it? So while drafting this clause, the lawyers must pay attention to the specific activities that would constitute
I did. You have 3
Azados.
minutes.
Okay, that would constitute Azados activities under the clause. There are some sporting associations that specifically prohibit taking part in certain activities. For instance, the NBA specifically prohibits boxing, professional wrestling, motorcycling, skydiving, and some other dangerous sporting activities. So another interesting clause in a standard player contract is the best effort clause. The clause mandates general acts of good faith by each party to the agreement, both the club and the player. So it ensures the player puts on his best while he's playing for the club. Arising from this clause also is the bonus or incentive clause. This clause ensures that the players project their skills to the best of their capabilities on the field by promising them maybe a certain percentage of their wages after a great feat, maybe winning a Champions League, for instance, and all that. There are also other important clauses in a player contract: the force majeure clause, the non-compete clause, the loyalty clause, which is very similar to the good faith clause. The loyalty clause allows the club to terminate the player's contract in the event that the player supports a cause contrary to the interest of a club. For instance, if Barcelona is being sponsored by Nike, Barcelona might insert in Messi's contract that he must not wear a brand that is competing with Nike, say Adidas or Reebok and the likes. So there are other important clauses such as transfer clause, termination clause, garden leave clause, which would be subsequently discussed later. So basically, the long and short of this overview is that while drafting a player's contract, certain considerations must be made and properly negotiated before a player signs a contract. Because if you look at a standard player's contract, you discover that there are certain clauses that if the lawyers do not pay attention to them, they would enter into a contract that would be disadvantageous to either the player or the club. Thank you.
Went over and beyond the call of duty, but I was wondering, while reading out all the important clauses in the player contract, shouldn't it have a commencement date? Shouldn't it have a remuneration clause?
Like I stated earlier, yes, it should. Commencement date is very important in a player's contract because a player's contract is not meant to inure in perpetuity. So I stated earlier that some of these clauses, they are boilerplate clauses, commencement date and all. So I just went straight to the most controversial clauses in a player's contract.
It's fine. Thank you very much. So let me pass the baton to Felix to deal with the RSCP. Felix, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, sir. Once again, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank my colleague LDG for sort of setting a primer on player contracts. So what I'll just be doing would be to give a cursory overview of the FIFA regulation on status and transfer of players. I'll take a two-pronged approach. I'll try as much as possible to stick to the relevant clauses in FIFA regulations that would pertain to player contractual relations, player club contractual relationships, and then I'll also try to give a summary of the new additions that were made to the regulations, because some additions were made early in the year. So first thing I'll say is FIFA regulation on status and transfer of players is a global and binding document which governs the relationship between a player and his club, sort of stating the eligibility of a player, his status, whether or not he's a professional or an amateur, depending on his age and where he plays, and then his eligibility to be transferred inter-association. The FIFA regulation, I'll just be calling RSTP just for convenience purposes. So the FIFA RSTP states also in its scope, in its applicability scope, that it generally pertains to transactions of an international nature. So more or less, if there's a transfer from one association to another association, then the FIFA RSTP comes into play. However, there are some provisions that are mandatory for even national associations. Ordinarily, those national associations should have their own governing documents, somewhat similar to what the RSTP has, which will be approved by FIFA, that will have some of those guidelines in place. But fortunately for us, what we're going to be looking at, some of those we're going to be looking at are those ones that cut across both the national associations as players within the same association and transfers or interactions between different associations. So the first thing we'll look at is the registration. Article 5 of the FIFA regulation of registration of players states that only electronically registered players that have a FIFA ID will be eligible to participate in organized football. So what that basically means is they are making it mandatory for any person participating in professional football to make use of the electronic domestic transfer matching system, or whatever electronic registration system that gives players a sort of identification. The purpose or import of that registration is there is this need for players to agree to be governed by FIFA rules and regulations because of the specificity of sports. So by that registration, those players are sort of, or by finalizing the registration, those players are sort of accepted to be governed by FIFA regulations. So in a situation where they digress, to now become, I'll call it a breach or something like that. So that's it for registration. Then we'll also look at contractual stability covered under Articles 13 to 17 of the RSTP. So some of those clauses, Article 13 now, for instance, states that a player's contract can be terminated on two grounds. One, that the contract has expired, that means the term has reached and lapsed, or by mutual agreement of parties. Subsequent articles also give rise to a situation where a contract can be unilaterally terminated. Now, the RSTP says that the contract cannot be unilaterally terminated during the course of a season for certain reasons. However, once a season has reached its end, either party could terminate a contractual agreement for reason of just cause or reason of sporting just cause. The article went further to give certain examples or instances where just cause may have arisen, and that is where there's a situation of abusive conduct or where a player has been owed salaries of at least 2 months and necessary steps has been taken with nothing foreseeable being done. So in that situation, just cause has been triggered and that player can unilaterally terminate his contract. Now, sporting just cause is invoked where a professional player that has been established and is contractually tied to a club has not been able to play up to 10% of the total games of that club in a season. In that sort of situation, sporting just cause has arisen, and then that player can also unilaterally terminate his contract. So when you could also go into Article 18, which talks about special provisions in contracts between professionals and clubs. So just briefly, its provisions sort of provide the minimum length of a contract, which it states to be for a full season period, and then the maximum length being for 5 years. So if you're drafting a contract, you have to do it within those stated timelines. Now, those new additions, which is that were made in the 2021 release, January 2021 release, which concerns female players, now allows female players under Article 18 to proceed on maternity leave, paid maternity leave, during the term of their contract. It also allows them to still engage in sporting activities during that time, and then choose when to return from maternity leave. So those are some things that were included, but I'll address them when I'm done with general overview of the RSTP first. So Article 18 BIS and Article 18 TER talks about third-party influence. Third-party influence is one thing that FIFA abhors for certain reasons. FIFA likes to, I just put it in this way, FIFA likes to put have a situation of, I'll say, control over their clubs. And then they also want those clubs to be independent to ensure that there's no interference in the way the activities is run. So over time, FIFA has sought to make sure that they remove external interference in any form. And that this is where 18 BIS and 18 TR comes in. So BIS is, as it pertains to clubs, sort of prohibits any third-party influence over a club. And then 18 TR is sort of pertaining to a club or player where a third party may have influence over the compensation rights that comes to the transfer of that player. So 18 BIS and TR sort of removes that contractually and makes any such action illegal and unenforceable. I will also look at Articles 19, which talks about protection of minors. Generally, transfer of minors under the FIFA RSTP is prohibited. So there can't be an international transfer of players under the age of 18. If such a transfer is effected contractually, that contract would not be binding. There are certain exceptions anyway, stated in the RSTP. Those are jurisdictional exceptions. I'll really go into them. So what I'll just do now is I'll just talk about the amendments to the 2021 RSTP. The RSTP sought to more or less improve the standing of female players and coaches in professional football. So it enshrined some provisions in the regulations to that effect. So some of the amendments are the provision of specific and improved level conditions for female players for maternity leave. There was now a specific definition for maternity leave, which is a minimum period of 14 weeks paid absence from sporting activities, where you leave 8 weeks to be taken after birth. They did this in line with the International Labour Convention. They also made sure that a female player's contract is not subject to whether or not the person becomes pregnant or exercises maternity rights. So they just excluded that, so you don't use it as something over the head of female players for validity purposes. Now, where a female player becomes pregnant, the RSTP has made it possible for them to have a right to either continue to provide the sporting services during that time or independently choose a start date for their maternity leave, and then also when they can return to football activity after completing said maternity leave. And the RSTP has also made it obligatory for clubs to provide postnatal services for female players during this time. Another new introduction in the RSTP is the ability of a player to be registered. This is for female players. A player to be registered to temporarily replace a female player who has gone on maternity leave. The registration can be done outside the allowable registration windows because of the peculiarity of the situation at hand. And these amendments are also binding even at the international level. So I just thought I'll mention that. Now, as for the coaches now, there are also some amendments basically to align coaches with other football participants with regards to their minimum standards for their employment contract, and then their legal framework for overdue payables, and then how they can also enforce their contracts under the RSTP, just like other football participants, like players, could before now. So I think those are the main changes here to the FIFA RSTP. Thank you.
Felix, well done. That was a very exhaustive analysis of the FIFA RSTP. I'm sure most of our listeners would like to gain more insights, particularly with regards to sporting just cause. Just to mention that there's a decided case involving Samsunspor Football Club of Turkey, and Aminu Umaru. Aminu Umaru was owed salaries in the region of about 3 months, and he terminated his contract. He walked away from his contract. And when the matter came up before CAS on appeal, because the club had challenged his rights to unilaterally terminate the contract, the Court of Arbitration for Sports took the view that 3 months salary arrears was more or less long time for a club to owe a player. And as a matter of fact, found for him on the grounds that the contract was terminated for sporting just cause. So these are concepts that more or less traverse the sporting landscape. You're going to be seeing them more often. And we come down here, and I'm sure ID is going to dwell on that. Come down here in the FPFL, you hear that players are owed salaries in the region of about 11 months, 15 months, and you wonder exactly why they've not been able to seek any form of redress. We'll come to all of that. So thank you once again, Felix, for that exhaustive analysis of the FIFA RSTP. So ID, I am calling on you now to deal with the of this first of